The estate inventory taken inside a Chicago mansion in 1936 lists 5 identical oak chests in the servants' quarters. Each chest was valued at $3. One of them stood in the room of Amanda Swanson, the family's laundress, who had been doing the Glessner wash since January 1929. The address was Prairie Avenue, one of the streets where Chicago's 19th century fortunes had built themselves houses meant to outlast their owners. The chests sat among the cheapest things the appraiser wrote down that day. The people those rooms were built for do not appear anywhere in the pages at all. In Chicago that same winter, John Glessner died. His death changed what the house on Prairie Avenue was. A residence organized around one man's habits became an estate administered under legal procedure. Everyone who worked in it, from the cook to the laundress, woke up inside a different kind of place, because the person whose word had governed their days could no longer answer for any of them. The inventory could price the chests. It had nothing to say about her. If quiet history told at this pace is why you press play, subscribing keeps these episodes coming. This is a story about that silence. When a millionaire died, the newspapers recorded the fortune, the family recorded the grief, and the lawyers recorded the assets. The servants appear mostly at the edges of those records, in wage lines and bequest schedules and census entries, which is exactly where this episode goes looking for them. Across several houses, several wills, and several decades, the same moment repeats. An employer dies, and the people who slept beside their work discover who really holds authority over them now. The grief was genuine, and so was the exposure, which is why the two have to be told together. The route ahead runs through probate offices and linen rooms alike. First, the system itself, what live-in service was and what held it together. Then the death watch, mourning duties performed, while the real decisions moved through lawyers' hands. Then the paper machine at full turn, inventories, and sworn valuations and wills read as instruments rather than sentiments. Then the outcomes, documented household by household, retention and legacy and departure, and one $3 chest. The question underneath every stage is the same one Swanson faced that winter, and it deserves stating plainly before any of it begins. Some were kept on by widows who chose continuity. Some follow heirs into other houses. Some found their names written into wills, in figures large and small. Some packed a trunk and went looking for a character letter that no law required anyone to give them. And one woman, in 1936, walked out of a Prairie Avenue mansion carrying what she alone had been invited to choose from her room. Which outcome landed on any particular worker was never random, but it was also never theirs to choose. It ran through documents bearing none of their signatures and decisions made in rooms they were never invited into. This episode follows those documents through half a dozen households, because inside their language is the entire answer to a question the servants themselves could only wait to hear resolved. To understand what a death actually cost the staff, it helps to first understand what a job in service actually was. Because the crisis of 1936 did not begin that winter. It began decades earlier, in the ordinary terms of employment that every maid, cook, and butler accepted without thinking twice. Live-in service bound a worker to a household more tightly than almost any other occupation of the era. The position supplied lodging and food alongside wages, which meant the worker's home and livelihood shared one address and one employer. Leave the post, and both disappeared together. Stay, and daily life ran according to the rhythms of the family upstairs. Their meals, their guests, their seasons, their moods. Inside that arrangement, distance from the family measured everything. Some posts lived in the family's own atmosphere, dressing its members, teaching its children, answering its door, where trust was the entire qualification and every working day was spent under an employer's eye. Other posts served the house's material needs at one remove, in kitchens, laundries, and corridors, essential to everything the family experienced and visible for none of it. Wages varied across that spectrum, and so did something harder to price: the closeness of the relationship on which a reference, a legacy, or a place in someone's will might later rest. Service rewarded proximity, and proximity was distributed by hiring luck long before any loyalty could accumulate. The money reflected that arrangement too. Domestic wages stayed low, precisely because room and board counted as part of the pay, so a servant's cash often remained small even after years of steady work. Saving was possible for the disciplined, especially for workers who had no family to support, but independence sat a long way off for most. Then there was the paper that outlived every job. In Britain, where much of the domestic service tradition that shaped American great houses had its roots, labor historians record that a mistress owed her servant 1 month's notice or wages in lieu of notice, but no law compelled her to provide a reference. Contemporaries called it a character, and few servants could gain another position without one. The person who signed it held no enforceable duty to sign it at all. That single fact shaped working lives. A servant's future employability lived in somebody else's handwriting. She could not demand the letter, and she could not force its wording to be fair. Employers understood the leverage this created, and so did the women and men who worked under them. Service was also, in a phrase modern workers would recognize and then not, a job that never ended. There was no clock to punch, and no shift whose close belonged to the worker. The household's needs set the hours, and the household's rooms were also the worker's address, so the workplace followed her to bed and met her again at dawn. Rest itself existed on sufferance of the schedule, subject to every guest, every season, every illness in the family above. None of this required cruelty to operate. An entirely ordinary household, kindly by temperament, still consumed its staff's time as households consume fuel, without particular attention to where it went. That was the real balance sheet of a career in service, and it looked nothing like a modern employment contract. Wages were owed and could be claimed. Notice was owed in defined amounts. Beyond those two lines, nearly everything else that mattered, the recommendation, the reputation, the quiet word that opened the next door, existed at the discretion of the household, renewed or withheld, one employer at a time. Amanda Swanson knew that arithmetic from the inside. Her whole life had prepared her for exactly one kind of work, and she had been doing it since long before she ever saw Prairie Avenue. She was born in 1881 in Porter, Indiana, the daughter of Swedish immigrants. Her schooling ended with the 8th grade, which was common enough for a farming family's daughter in those years. And by around 1910, she was living in Chicago supporting herself as a laundress. Laundry stood among the hardest work a household could generate. It meant water heated in quantity, fabric scrubbed against boards, starches, irons heated on stoves, and hours measured by the pile rather than the clock. Within the internal geography of great house service, laundry also occupied some of the least visible ground. A butler's work happened in front of guests and reflected directly on the family's standing. A parlor maid polished the rooms visitors saw. The laundry happened somewhere out of sight, in basement workrooms or annex quarters, producing stacks of immaculate linen whose makers the diners never had to picture. The better the household ran, the less anyone upstairs thought about the hands that kept it running, and no position demonstrated that principle more thoroughly than Swanson's. In January 1929, at the age of 47, she took a position with the Glessner family as their laundress. The timing would prove quietly significant. She signed on 9 months before the stock market crash, into work steady enough that it carried her straight through the Depression years that battered so many other employments. The wage survives in the household's own records. $4.50 per day, plus car fare, paid to a woman who at first did not live in the house at all. She rented a room miles north, on Rokeby Street in Lakeview, and commuted to Prairie Avenue like any other working woman of the city. The car fare matters more than it looks. It marks the arrangement as a genuine day job in those first years. Employment with a commute, wages calculated by the day, and a separate address the household never controlled. Her room north of the work was hers in the ordinary rental sense, paid for out of her own pocket, held independently of her employer's goodwill. Sometime in the 1930s, that changed. She moved into the servants' quarters of the mansion itself and settled among the household's permanent staff. The independent address disappeared into the employer's building, and with it went whatever small separations a commute had preserved. Her housing now came as part of the compensation, which meant her home existed at her employer's pleasure in the most literal way available. The house had been built in 1887, and much of its furnishing dated to those early years. Somewhere in those quarters, 5 identical oak chests had probably stood since the house was first furnished. Plain storage for plain rooms, worth so little to the family that they appear never to have been replaced across nearly 50 years. One of them became hers, in the sense that anything became yours in service. It stood in her room and held her things. Family members who remembered her later described a devoted aunt, the one who arrived with treats and small gifts for the children of her siblings. That is the kind of detail a family keeps, and it is nearly the only kind of detail that survives about a laundress, because institutions rarely bother to describe the woman who boiled the linens. By 1936, she had spent 7 years in the Glessners' employ. She had worked through the crash and the first years of the Depression, years when any position was worth keeping. She was 54 years old that winter, weeks short of her 55th birthday, and the man at the top of the household, The quiet center around which all of that routine turned was dying. Death entered a great house as a set of tasks before it ever registered as an emotion. The era had developed an entire material vocabulary for loss, and wealthy families spoke it fluently. When Louise Vanderbilt died on August 21, 1926, at the Hotel Ritz in Paris, her body had to travel home to New York. Her husband Frederick arranged passage aboard the White Star liner Homeric, and part of the ship's lower deck baggage room was converted into a chapel for the crossing, decorated with wreaths and flowers, the staircase draped in black. At journey's end, she was buried in the Vanderbilt Mausoleum at Moravian Cemetery on Staten Island. Every element of that passage required hands. Flowers ordered, drapery hung, spaces cleared and converted, schedules adjusted around a coffin. Mourning on this scale was logistics performed in advance of grief, and the people performing it were usually staff, whose own futures had nothing to do with wreaths. The route itself tells you what elite death demanded of arrangements. A woman died in Paris. Her body crossed the Atlantic aboard a passenger liner whose operator accommodated a funeral chapel in its baggage deck. Mourners and reporters waited at the New York end. Burial waited at a family mausoleum on Staten Island. Between those points stood weeks of coordination, involving shipping lines, customs, florists, undertakers, clergy, rail connections, and households on 2 continents, all set moving by telegrams and letters in the weeks after August 21, 1926. Somebody maintained that correspondence file. Somebody paid those invoices. The elegance of the arrangement was real, and so was the labor folded invisibly inside it. Paper carried the news the same way. The practice of bordering letters and envelopes with black edging reached its height in the Victorian era and crossed into American life. Thick bands announcing deep bereavement, thinner ones distant kinship. Newspapers of the 19th century printed a black border around reported deaths. A household in mourning wrote on stationery that announced its condition to everyone downstream of the mailbox. The conventions ran to details that sound almost administrative. Border width could signal the closeness of the loss, so that the death of a child warranted a heavier frame than the death of a cousin. The wax seals paired with such correspondence were conventionally black. Etiquette even assigned the practice by age, holding that children did not send mourning-bordered letters at all. None of this was decoration for its own sake. It was a communication system, legible to every recipient, and like all systems of its era, it required somebody downstairs or nearby to keep the supplies, fold the notes, and post the results. For the staff of a mourning household, the visible machinery translated directly into work. Extra callers meant extra door answering, extra coats, extra refreshment carried up. Flowers arrived in volumes private houses never handled otherwise. Meals shifted around the schedule of services and visitors. Whatever grief the family expressed openly, the house expressed operationally, through rearranged labor, and the people executing that rearrangement were the same ones whose own positions hung unread in the desk drawers upstairs. Behind the crepe and the bordered envelopes, other documents waited that concerned the staff far more directly. Wills, inventories, wage accounts, notices, while the house above stairs filled with callers and flowers. the legal machinery beneath the household began to turn. And that machinery answered none of the questions servants cared about most. Whether the staff stayed, left, or starved quietly depended on answers that had not yet arrived. Who inherited? Who executed? Whether the widow would keep the house running or close it. Whether anyone had thought to write a servant's name down anywhere at all. The weeks of a formal mourning period were therefore stranger for the staff floor than any account centered on the family can show. Above stairs, grief had its script and its schedule, services to attend, callers to receive, black fabric to wear. Downstairs, the script ran out quickly. Laundry continued, since mourning multiplies linens rather than pausing them. Meals continued, for a household expanded by relatives and mourners. And underneath the ordinary work sat an unanswerable waiting, each worker carrying private arithmetic about what the death meant for her own position while performing the rituals of someone else's loss. The record rarely captures that double state directly. It shows up instead in outcomes, in how fast households emptied after masters died, and in how much depended on whether some document or some survivor happened to speak for the people who had kept the whole performance running. Those answers arrived on paper, in offices far from any kitchen, and to see how completely paper took over once a millionaire died, it helps to watch what the law did with a house like that one. Authority over a household had been personal while the employer lived. The moment it lapsed, a short and unforgiving list of successors existed. A widow might take charge and keep things running. An heir might inherit the property outright, along with whatever staff came attached to it. Executors named in a will would control the estate's money during settlement, regardless of who inherited anything. Creditors might press claims. Eventually, a house itself could be sold to strangers, given to an institution, or closed altogether. Each path carried different consequences for the people in the attic. A surviving spouse meant continuity was possible, though never guaranteed. Bertha Cohn of Blowing Rock, North Carolina, would become the era's most patient example, holding one household together for 39 years after her husband's death. Her story arrives later in this account, because it deserves full weight. An heir meant relocation entered the calculations. Staff who had served one residence might be offered places in another. If the heir kept multiple houses or moved to a different city entirely. The whole geography of a working life could shift with an inheritance, and refusing to shift with it meant resigning from service altogether. Executors meant something stranger. Here were people who held real power over a servant's immediate future without ever having managed her, evaluated her, or learned her name past the payroll. They controlled the accounts that paid outstanding wages. They commissioned inventories that turned rooms into lists. Their pace of work shaped, within the limits of probate procedure, how quickly a household liquidated, and therefore how quickly positions ended. Each of these successors appears in the documented record of this account. The widow who continued appears at Flat Top Manor, holding one household together for 39 years. The heirs who inherited appear in Louise Vanderbilt's will, where the bulk of an estate above $1 million flowed to two nieces and a sister, and in Thomas Williams's, where the residue went to a brother and a sister, while his widow held lifetime use of the house. The executors appear in every probate file this episode touches, unnamed in its pages, but present in every sworn valuation and every paid account. The institution appears at Springwood, where the successor was the United States government. The only successor on the list that the surviving record here never populates is the buyer, an unknown purchaser whose acquisition of a great house would have handed its staff to an employer none of them had chosen. That silence is itself information. Sales happened often enough that the era understood them, yet the households this account follows ended instead in retention, inheritance, and institutional transfer, and so the buyer remains the road not taken in these particular stories. And underneath all of them ran the impersonal layer, courts and registries and tax offices, where the estate became a file and the household became arithmetic. Which path a particular house followed depended on a handful of variables no servant controlled. The size and liquidity of the estate mattered, because an estate rich in property but short on cash closed differently than one flush with marketable securities. The successor's own life shaped it, whether a widow wished to keep a house she had run for decades, whether an heir already maintained another residence with staff of its own. The skills of the individual workers mattered too, since a famous cook or a trusted butler carried market value into any transition, while general maids competed in the most crowded labor category in the country. Nothing in that list included length of service, loyalty, or need. The system distributed its continuities by inheritance logic, not by merit. The arithmetic is not a figure of speech, it survives. British death duty registers, preserved at the National Archives, show the system plainly. From 1857 onward, estates above £20 passed through probate courts that forwarded each will to the Inland Revenue, where duty was calculated. Clerks recorded the executors by name, address, and occupation in columns headed for exactly that purpose. Another column held the sum sworn under, the approximate value of the total estate, excluding debts and expenses. Further columns tracked whether duty was paid, when payments occurred, and in the case of annuities, which of the usual 4 installments had come due. Read those registers cold, and you learn something unsettling about how the law saw a household. The widow appears as a name with an address. The house appears as a number. The servants appear not at all, unless their unpaid wages happen to count among the debts subtracted before the sworn sum was taken. The archive around those registers tells its own story about fragility. Before 1858, wills in England and Wales passed through a lattice of ecclesiastical courts, which forwarded their records into the duty system afterward. Early volumes contain only brief abstracts of wills, rather than full texts. Estates below £1,500 generated so little paperwork that detail thins out dramatically, meaning the overwhelming majority of modest estates, including any household employing a single maid, left the lightest possible footprint. Many of the registers themselves from the 1890s were later destroyed outright. Even the accounts of money actually received as duty were mostly discarded, with survivors preserved mainly for notable individuals. So the paper machinery that outlived every person it processed has been quietly dissolving too. What survives is partial, weighted toward the large estates that generated duplicate copies, indexed summaries, and correspondence worth keeping. A researcher tracing what probate did to one mansion's staff works against both silences at once: the original silence about workers and the accumulated silence of destroyed records. American practice differed in detail, but not in direction. Probate still meant proving a will, swearing values, notifying creditors, paying debts and duties, and only then distributing what remained. The inventory sat at the heart of that process, and it deserves attention as a document type, because it is where this episode keeps finding its people absent. An inventory existed to make an estate administrable. Executors or their agents moved through the property, recording what was there, room by room, object by object, assigning values so that debts could be paid, duties calculated, legacies satisfied, and shares divided without argument. Every entry answered a legal need. Nothing else qualified for inclusion. A household staff appeared in such papers only at the edges, as wage balances owed, or as the occupants implied by furniture labeled servants' quarters. 5 identical oak chests, value $3 apiece. The inventory could say exactly what a dead man's world was worth, down to the dollar, while saying nothing about the people whose labor had maintained any of it, because valuation was its job, and labor was not property. Thomas C. Williams, Jr. of Richmond, left instructions whose categories tell the whole story. His will, dated August 13, 1928, and amended by codicil on September 3, directed his estate to cover executor commissions, funeral costs, outstanding debts, and any inheritance taxes his beneficiaries owed. Only after all of that did his actual gifts begin. An executor worked through a dead man's house in a strict order of precedence, and none of the early steps cared who had loyally served it for decades. Wages earned before death ranked among the claims. Sentiment did not rank at all. That precedence tells you exactly where a servant's most enforceable right actually lived. Unpaid wages belong to the same legal category as the butcher's bill and the coal account, debts of the estate, payable before any gift to any beneficiary, including the family. In one sense, this was real protection. A solvent estate was expected to settle what it owed its workers, and the law gave those wage claims priority over legacies. In another sense, the protection was brutally narrow. It covered work already performed and money already earned, and it stopped at the boundary of the payroll. Notice worked the same way, as obligation rather than benefit. The settled British practice owed a servant 1 month's notice or its cash equivalent when employment ended. An estate winding down a household was expected to honor that arithmetic, and a servant dismissed without cause could point to it. What notice never did was preserve the position itself. A month of paid time is not continuity, and for a live-in worker, the month came attached to a departure date, after which the lodging that had defined her housing situation converted back into a market rent she would now pay alone. Between the wage claim and the notice period, the law's entire promise to a dying household's staff fits in 2 lines. Everything else that determined what happened next, the reference, the retention, the remembrance, the recommendation to a friend's household lived in the discretionary territory this episode keeps crossing. This is why probate repays a calm description rather than a sinister one. Nobody in the process was conspiring against the staff. The machinery simply had no column for them because their protection was supposed to live somewhere else. In contracts, in custom, in the goodwill of whoever succeeded. When the machinery started turning, it revealed precisely how thin that somewhere else had been all along. The process also never required anything on the staff's behalf. No officer of the court notified a household's servants that their positions had entered settlement. Nobody represented their interest in hearings about pace or liquidation, because no such representative role existed. The estate's obligations toward them were real but passive, sitting quietly as line items until some executor's clerk reached them in the order of precedence. A worker learned what her future held, the way she had learned everything else in service, through word traveling downstairs from wherever decisions were actually being made. Timing followed the same passive logic. Wages owed ranked ahead of legacies, but nothing paid until the estate moved, and estates moved at the speed of their executors, their courts, and their paperwork. A household staff could wait out months of valuation and claim settlement before money owed for work already performed crossed any palm. The debt was certain in principle and unhurried in fact, which suited an estate fine and suited nobody who needed the wage to live on, while the position that produced it dissolved underneath her. So what did the law actually promise a servant whose employer died? Less than most people assume, and the gap between assumption and reality defined careers. In Britain, the settled terms were these: 1 month's notice, or wages in its place. Wages already earned, recoverable as a debt. Protection against instant dismissal, except for defined causes, insubordination, and defiance of proper orders among them, though the worker carried the burden of proof. That burden was not theoretical. In 1913, a county court heard the case of a servant dismissed for answering her mistress saucily. She claimed wages. The court ruled she could not prove her word against her mistress's word, and the claim failed. 2 people, 1 incident, and the legal system weighing testimony it had structurally no way to verify, because no third party ever witnessed what happened inside private kitchens and corridors. The same structural silence awaited any wage claim pressed after an employer's death. The one witness who might have confirmed the terms was gone, and the estate answered through representatives whose information ran no deeper than its books. If the books recorded the debt, the claim paid smoothly like any other obligation. If the books were short, or the arrangement had lived in custom rather than ink, the worker stood roughly where the 1913 claimant had stood, holding a true account she could not prove. Death thus hardened the employment relationship into its documents, at the precise moment the documents were thinnest. The reference sat outside all of these protections entirely. Reformers saw the problem clearly enough. They petitioned lawmakers to compel mistresses to provide written references subject to the ordinary libel laws, which would have given servants both a document and a remedy against false ones. No such legislation ever passed in Britain. Consider what that meant at the specific moment this episode keeps returning to. Everything a servant had earned in a decade of service was summarized nowhere but in the opinion of her employer. The employer died. The opinion died with him, or survived only through a widow's kindness, or hardened into whatever line a busy relative typed into a reference letter on the way to clearing the house. A sympathetic employer's death was therefore uniquely dangerous, and not because sympathetic employers paid less or more than harsh ones. It was dangerous because sympathy had been load-bearing. The person most willing to speak generously was gone. The person most likely to write the next character knew the worker least. Every favorable judgment the old employer might have rendered in the future vanished into probate alongside everything else he owned. How much weight that single opinion carried is easiest to see when it turned hostile. Labor historians record the case of Jean Rennie, a cook dismissed in the 1930s after her employer discovered she was also a writer. She had admitted the fact, and the admission ended the position. What followed was not another job at similar wages, but destitution. And the reason was structural rather than personal. A cook of real skill stood among the most sought-after workers in the entire service economy, yet without a usable character from the last employer. Even her trade's demand could not reach her. The reference did more than help a servant find work. It stood between the servant and work, and whoever held it decided which side of that line she lived on. The same leverage operated preventively, long before any dismissal. Employers understood, and servants understood, that complaints about wages, hours, or treatment could poison the paper that governed a working life. A mistress who chose to give a bad character could end a career as effectively as any blacklist, and no statute compelled the wording to be fair. Workers who left on good terms had every incentive to leave quietly. Workers mistreated badly enough to risk speaking had to weigh speech against employability, and the arithmetic rarely favored honesty. Rennie's story survived because she later wrote it down herself, an account preserved in print, which is its own commentary on how such outcomes normally left no trace at all. For couples in service, the exposure doubled. A married pair employed by the same household stood to lose 2 incomes in one probate, and such pairs were common because service schedules made ordinary family life nearly impossible outside the trade's own ranks. James Deering's staff included one such couple. Their experience shows what remained when an employer died, and the documents said nothing about them at all. Pause before meeting them, though, because a midpoint correction belongs here. Everything so far has sounded like grief and household loyalty colliding with cold procedure. The truth runs one level deeper than that. Sentiment does not decide what happens to servants after a death. Instruments decide, and each instrument carried its own logic. Wills are the clearest example, because they come in deliberate shapes. A testator could leave a servant a lump sum, payable once. A testator could leave an annuity, payable year after year for life. The difference between those two instruments is the difference between a bonus and an income, and wealthy testators understood it perfectly. The New York Times recorded one such arrangement when it filed notice on September 30, 1920, under the headline, "File American Will of Astor's Sister." Mrs. Charlotte Augusta Haig left annuities for secretary and 2 servants. That is nearly everything the surviving record says. No first names for the servants, no amounts, no service histories. One feature of the headline repays attention even so. The secretary stands named as a category alongside the 2 servants, which places white-collar household labor and domestic labor in a single line of continuing provision. Households of this scale employed people whose work was clerical, professional, intimate, and manual all at once, and this testator grouped them together in remembrance. Whatever the amounts, the grouping itself says something about how one wealthy woman mapped the population that had run her life. Even the headline's verbs belong to probate procedure rather than to anyone's life. Filing a will is the act of submitting it to the court that will prove it and open the estate, which means the newspaper was not reporting gossip about generosity. It was reporting paperwork beginning, an estate entering the machine whose operation this episode has been describing. The secretary and 2 servants entered the machine with it, as line items carrying a different kind of promise than any examined so far. Even stripped bare, the headline documents something important. In at least some estates, remembrance was engineered as carefully as any trust for the family. Someone chose annuities over bequests. Someone calculated that a secretary and 2 servants should draw income for as long as they lived, rather than receive a single payment they might spend or lose. The choice of an annuity over a lump sum also answers a question the giver never had to voice. A one-time bequest spends down and disappears, and a worker past her strongest earning years might watch it vanish inside a few hard winters. An annuity renews annually by design, closer in shape to the wage it replaced than to any bonus. A private pension assembled before pensions were common, tied to the beneficiary's lifetime rather than to any lump sum. Whatever else such instruments did, they acknowledged that service's end stage could last decades, and that a single payment answered none of them. The probate machinery even kept its own watch over such arrangements. British death duty registers tracked annuity obligations across time, with duty on them usually collected in 4 installments rather than 1, so the paperwork revisited these continuing gifts across their installments, year after year. An annuity was not generosity concluded at the funeral. It was a running entry the state expected to keep seeing, which made it structurally different from every lump sum in every schedule examined here. For the named few, that was genuine protection of a rare kind. For the vast majority of domestic workers, it was a category they never entered, because most estates never contained their names at all. The instrument decided. It always decided. Louise Vanderbilt's will shows the same logic operating inside a much larger architecture, where the question is no longer whether servants appear, but how far down the schedule their names sit. The woman behind that will had been carried home across the Atlantic, inside a baggage room, converted into a chapel, her staircase draped in black, her arrival staged for mourners. A will performs the same kind of staging for everything that cannot attend its own funeral. It arranges the household's afterlife in advance, assigns rooms of money to their occupants, and fixes in ink who stands where in the order of regard. Reading it afterward is as close as the record allows anyone to come to watching a wealthy household's inner hierarchy declared out loud. Her estate was estimated at more than $1 million. 6 charitable institutions received $10,000 each, among them the Children's Aid Society, Woman's Hospital, and the ASPCA. Her largest single bequest was a trust fund of $300,000 to establish the Anthony Home, a model residential building for working women. Her husband, Frederick, received part of her jewelry, and Sonagy, the Bar Harbor residence in Maine. The bulk of the estate went to her 2 nieces and her sister. And then the schedule reaches the people who had worked inside her houses. Friends and employees, the record says, received bequests of various amounts. Set beside each other, the 2 lines say more than either manages alone. The charities are itemized down to payments of exactly $10,000 apiece, and every institution is named in full. The employees dissolve into a summary phrase, various amounts, without a figure, a name, or a role attached. In the very document meant to settle her obligations precisely, precision stopped at the boundary of her staff. The asymmetry also forecloses something for anyone reading the will a century later. Whether any individual employee received enough to matter, whether one loyal maid got a year's wages or 10, cannot be ranked or even guessed, because the schedule never bothered to record it. Institutions received their sums as institutions deserve them, in public, item by item. Employees received theirs as staff always received everything in that world, privately, in amounts nobody outside the house needed to know. The will preserves the difference in treatment and hides the treatment itself, which may be the most honest sentence any probate file ever wrote about domestic service. The $300,000 trust deserves its own honest look. A model residence for working women was a serious philanthropic act, and the women it housed were exactly the class of workers this episode follows. The same document that funded their housing declined to itemize what her own employees would receive. Both facts stand. Generosity and hierarchy shared a page, which is perhaps the most precise thing a will can record about how intimate service actually counted. There is a fitting symmetry in where that page leaves her. In life, Louise Vanderbilt's crossings and residences ran on arrangements made by workers whose names she was not recorded as writing down anywhere. In death, the arrangements continued, a schedule drawn by one hand assigning every remaining relationship its position. The woman whose baggage deck became a chapel now had her own household converted into lines of type, and the people who had maintained her world occupied those lines at whatever distances the draftsmanship left them. Nothing in that schedule dismissed anyone or cheated anyone. A servant named somewhere under various amounts might have received a month's wages or several years' worth, and the record as preserved does not say. What the schedule proves is position. When a testator arranged $1 million estate, the staff occupied the same region of attention as miscellaneous personal effects, remembered together, priced together, identified as nothing in particular. Thomas C. Williams, Jr. of Richmond left behind a schedule generous enough to measure the distance exactly. Williams died on February 14, 1929, at the age of 65, holding more than $3 million in assets across money and real estate. The document distributing it carried dates worth noticing. He signed the will on August 13, 1928, and added the codicil exactly 3 weeks later, on September 3. 5.5 months afterward, he was dead. Whatever reflections attended that final half year produced an instrument of unusual thoroughness. Categories within categories. Trusts beside funds. Every relationship he recognized assigned its figure, including the category called long-time servants. His cash bequests alone totaled $2,811,500. Friends received $10,000 apiece. Employees received amounts ranging from $1,000 to $5,000. Long-time servants, the will's own category, received bequests between $1,000 and $3,000. Younger relatives received money along with gifts of jewelry or guns. Against the whole of that distribution, the servant figures speak plainly enough. A loyal worker's remembrance ran between $1,000 and $3,000 inside a distribution of $2,811,500 beneath the flat gift of $10,000 reserved for friends, and nowhere near the trusts. Nobody had to guess at their standing. The page stated it numerically, in ranges fixed months earlier by a man arranging his affairs, long before anyone knew which servant would still be employed when he died. The rest of the estate followed the pattern every great house will seems to share. Elizabeth Booker Williams received a large trust, plus lifetime use of Agecroft Hall. The Tudor manor Williams had moved to Richmond stone by stone, with a separate fund endowed for its upkeep. The codicil extended provisions to her mother and sisters. The residue went to his brother Adolph and his sister Sue. His largest gift was Agecroft itself, designated as the Agecroft Hall Library and Gallery of Art, T.C. Williams Family Memorial, in the hope, as he wrote, that it would prove a source of pleasure and instruction to the people of Richmond. What the 3-week later amendment chose to adjust says as much as what it left alone. Family provisions widened to take in his widow's mother and sisters, the recognized circle expanding at the edge of a life. Nothing in the surviving summary suggests the servants' figures moved with it. The $1,000 to $3,000 range stood in the original instrument and stood unamended afterward, fixed while the family's orbit grew around it. Whether that reflected satisfaction with the original sums or simple priority of attention, the document does not say. It says only who was worth revisiting in the final weeks of planning, and the answer ran along the family lines the marriage had created. The word residue carries more weight in such documents than newcomers expect. Everything a will names specifically, every niece's jewelry, every friend's $10,000, every servant's fixed $1,000 to $3,000, is carved off the top. The residue is whatever remains after all those named claims, plus the debts, the funeral costs, the executor commissions, and the taxes have each taken their share. By directing the remainder to his siblings, Williams closed the system, guaranteeing that nothing unlisted could float free. A servant's bequest sat inside that architecture as a carved piece, fixed in amount regardless of what the residue later weighed, which cut both ways. If the estate shrank, the servant's figure held. If it swelled, none of the growth flowed toward the people at the bottom of the schedule. Loyalty, in this document, converted into numbered gifts. The conversion rate was set by the testator's pen. The servants affected by it had no more influence over those figures than they had over the weather, because the will was executed exactly as written, and none of them were present when it was made, in any sense that mattered. Before concluding that such schedules reveal coldness, this account owes the opposite case its strongest form, because in at least one documented household, an employer's death cost the servants almost nothing, and the arrangement held for nearly 4 decades. Moses H. Cohn was 51 years old when he died unexpectedly on December 8, 1908, of heart disease. His death had a documented approach, even so. In 1906, he and Bertha took a trip around the world, the kind of grand tour wealthy Americans used both as adventure and as medicine. After their return, his health failed, first into chest pains and indigestion, and an evaluation at Johns Hopkins Hospital in Baltimore produced a diagnosis of heart problems in 1907. Whatever the family knew or feared across that final year, the death itself landed on the estate as an event, sudden in timing if not in direction. He had built his fortune in textiles alongside his brothers, and he had built an estate to match, Flat Top Manor, a sprawling mountain property near Blowing Rock, North Carolina. He was buried on his own land, in the family cemetery at a spot he had chosen while alive. Every household in this account met its master's death as disruption first and arrangement second. What differed was what the survivors did with the disruption. Inside the manor, a staff of African-American servants ran the household: cooks, laundry maids, chambermaids, parlor maids, a butler, and in later years, a chauffeur. They lived in 2 cottages positioned behind the manor house. That arrangement deserves more than a passing phrase, because it describes an entire residential community existing in service's shadow. Behind the summer house stood a second settlement of family homes, whose working adults kept the great house operating. The roll list reads like the anatomy of a small hotel, yet it belonged to one household's private requirements, sustained year after year at the height of one fortune. These were skilled positions in a settled community, and like live-in staff everywhere, their employment rested on the continuity of the family above them. His widow Bertha provided that continuity for 39 years. She outlived Moses by nearly 4 decades, managed the estate with what the National Park Service calls competent stewardship, and drew income that included annual payments tied to Moses's co-ownership stake in the Cohn textile business. Flat Top Manor remained her summer home for the rest of her life, shared in season with her sisters. The staff who had served Moses found themselves serving the same household under the same roof well into the 20th century. Bertha died at Flat Top Manor on June 8, 1947, at the age of 89. Even her death did not scatter the property into market lots. A family indenture, dating to 1911, directed estate funds toward building the Moses H. Cohn Memorial Hospital in Greensboro, begun in 1949 and opened in 1953, and the hospital eventually guided the estate into the hands of the National Park Service along the Blue Ridge Parkway, where it survives today as a public park at milepost 294. For the staff question this episode follows, even that institutional ending repeats the old pattern in new dress. The property passed from a widow's private choice to a hospital's stewardship to a federal park agency, each successor inheriting buildings, grounds, and maintenance work without any documented accounting of the people who had performed it across 4 decades. Whatever became of the cottage households when the manor changed from home to attraction sits below the sightline of every record consulted here. The continuity Bertha built was real, and so was its ceiling. It lasted exactly as long as she did, after which the estate's future continued while its people's stories returned once more to silence. Take this case seriously, because it narrows the claim honestly. An employer's death did not automatically dissolve a household. Where a widow possessed the money, the legal control, and the will to continue, servants could keep their places, their cottages, and their routines across entire working lifetimes. Continuity was real, it happened. Nor was Bertha Cohn the only successor who preserved rather than dissolved. In another household entirely, a different kind of successor chose preservation too, as a widow and her children would one day sign away life interests at Springwood and hand a fully staffed compound to the United States government, extending its working world under new management rather than closing it. The pattern exists. Death exposed households to their successors' choices, and successors sometimes chose preservation. But look at what it rested on. One woman's inheritance, one income stream from a textile fortune, one person's private decision, renewed implicitly every year, that the household should go on. None of it belonged to the staff as a right. Had Bertha chosen to close the house in 1909, or had she died before him, the same workers would have faced the same inventories and the same unanswered questions as everyone else in this story. Their security existed exactly as long as she kept choosing to provide it, which is another way of saying it was never theirs at all. From that mountain exception, the account turns to its opposite, a household where no successor's choice preserved anything, and where 2 workers had to build an afterlife from almost nothing the estate left them. The names outside every will discussed so far belong to most of the people these houses ever employed. That is not an accusation. It is a description of how the documents were built. And following even one name that survives outside a will shows what the paper trail could and could not hold. Anna Maria Leach was born Anna Edling, and her employer's records would never have preserved that fact. Her maiden name survives because researchers traced it through her paperwork, and a passenger list places her arrival in the United States in 1909, traveling with her sister Agnes, 2 young women from Europe stepping into an ocean of other arrivals, at exactly the moment American great houses were consuming domestic labor faster than cities could supply it. By the early 19-teens, she was working for James Deering in Chicago. Deering was heir to the international harvester fortune, a man of severe private health problems and magnificent public tastes, and he maintained staff in Chicago for his life there, while building his winter dream on the water in Miami. Vizcaya, the villa he completed in the 1910s, was less a house than a constructed European fantasy on Biscayne Bay. And like every such fantasy, it required a permanent, invisible population to operate. Anna married Frederick Leach in 1916. Frederick served Deering as butler, a post that in establishments of this scale placed a man near the summit of the downstairs world, answerable for the formal machinery of dining and service, and for coordination among the staff beneath him. A parlor maid and a butler made an unusually well-matched couple inside service, both professionals, both permanent, both employed by the same man. Their daughter Violette was born in Chicago in 1919. Her birthplace, as later recorded, was Deering's home on Lakeshore Drive. That detail compresses an entire working culture into one line. A servant gave birth in her employer's residence, which shows how completely service owned the calendar. And the record says so without embarrassment, because nobody involved considered it strange. The Leaches lived on site at Vizcaya in the village, the cluster of workers' quarters Deering built to keep his staff close at hand. The architecture stated its own logic. A villa assembled as a winter fantasy could not function with its staff scattered across a young city's boarding houses, so the estate built its labor force into the grounds, proximity designed into the floor plan. For a married couple in service, housing shared under one roof on the estate that employed them both was among the few stable shapes family life could take inside the service system. It kept the household unit whole as it moved with the work, which is exactly what the record then shows. A wife, a husband, and eventually a daughter embedded in one establishment rather than attached to any single city. Their working year divided itself between Chicago and Miami as Deering moved between residences, which meant their home, their community, and their child's world packed and unpacked with the seasons. Service did more than employ this family. It most likely relocated them twice a year, as the record itself allows, and housed them inside its own architecture. Consider what that circuit demanded in practical terms. A seasonal move between residences was not a trip. It was the temporary relocation of an entire working establishment, because a house without its staff did not function. However Deering's arrangements were organized in detail, someone had to be in each city before the household required feeding, dressing, and receiving guests there, and someone had to close the other establishment behind it. Every year, the Leaches lived through 2 relocations that wealth scheduled for its own comfort, and every year their competence was part of the reason those moves held together. The record preserves none of their opinions about this arrangement, which is precisely why the geography matters. Wherever their feelings sat, their bodies and their child's birthplace followed Deering's calendar. Anna's own path into that circuit had run through Chicago years earlier, working for the same man in the city before Vizcaya existed to draw him south. She crossed from employee of a household into fixture of an establishment, the kind of long-tenured servant great houses relied on, precisely because such workers carried the institutional memory no new hire could supply. James Deering died in 1925. No will provision for the Leaches is recorded in anything consulted for this account. No annuity, no legacy, no named remembrance appears under their names, in contrast to the households examined earlier, where testators did write servants down. What happened to them afterward is documented anyway, through the unglamorous machinery of censuses and city directories. After Deering's death, the Leaches stayed in Miami. Census records confirm it, and so does the Miami City Directory, year after year. Anna remains traceable in the city from 1930 until her death in 1989, 64 years after the employer, whose movements had governed hers, came to an end. That single fact reframes what losing an employer meant. The Leaches lost the position, the village, the seasonal circuit between two cities, and the entire structure their working lives had hung on. They did not leave Miami, the city their employment had delivered them to. Whatever roots years of service had put down proved strong enough to hold once the reason for those roots was gone. Deering's death ended their employment. It did not end their address. In the ledger of possible outcomes for household staff, that counts as one of the quiet good ones. And notice what produced it. Not sentiment recorded anywhere, but a couple with skills, presumably savings, and a city they had decided to remain in. The documentary trail can show where they settled. It cannot show how they managed it, and honesty requires leaving that blank. It cannot even show whether they worked again, whether Frederick buddled in another Miami household, whether Anna took positions in the city's growing winter resort economy, whether they lived on savings or on wages continued somewhere unrecorded. None of it appears in the sources consulted here. The directories confirm presence, year after year, and stop at presence. What is certain is that the couple faced 1926 together, without the employer whose calendar had organized them, in a city far from Anna's arrival port and Frederick's unknown origin point, and that they stayed whole long enough for a census taker in 1930 and every directory clerk afterward to keep finding them at the same coordinates. Meanwhile, the rest of Deering's village staff dispersed into the same silence that swallowed every other great house's people. No roster of who stayed in service and who left the city survives in this account's sources. The couple became visible because marriage gave researchers two names to join. Colleagues without that documentary luck remain exactly where history filed them, unnamed inside a building that still stands. There is a lesson hiding in the method, though. Everything known about Anna Leach comes from documents generated for other purposes entirely. A shipping manifest wanted passengers. A naturalization file wanted identifiers. Censuses wanted heads of households. Directories wanted employable men at fixed addresses. None of these papers cared about her, and yet together they sketch a complete enough life to tell this story, which is more than most servants of the era got. Most got nothing, because most never crossed paths with a document that stuck. The archive remembers selectively, and its memory follows paper, not people. When a museum researcher today can reconstruct a parlor maid's decades-long afterlife in Miami, it is because bureaucracy happened to touch her repeatedly, not because anyone set out to preserve her story. The workers who avoided institutional contact simply vanish between the census years, present only as absences in rooms we know were occupied. Springwood stood above the Hudson River, its grounds running east from the water, and by the time Franklin Roosevelt died there, it anchored a property of nearly 1,600 acres, containing roughly 18 buildings. Springwood itself, Val Kill, Top Cottage, gardens, a working farm, and the first presidential library any nation had built for its own head of state. This was a household compound of serious scale, and it ran on serious staff. FDR's mother, Sarah, had employed about a dozen servants to manage life at Springwood: maids, butlers, valets, gardeners, cooks, and governesses among them. A dozen is the number worth keeping. Roughly 12 people's livelihoods, housing arrangements, and daily routines hung from one family's continued presence in one building. The composition of that dozen repays a second look. Maids and cooks covered the daily interior work. Butlers and valets served the formal surfaces of the household, its table and its wardrobe. Gardeners belonged to the property rather than the rooms, tied to grounds that grew to encompass gardens, farm, and forest. And governesses signal something easily missed. That child-rearing and education in such families ran partly inside the staff structure. Professional women living in, who taught the young as their employment. Each role carried its own housing arrangement, its own distance from or proximity to the family, its own vulnerability whenever the family's presence changed. When Roosevelt reached the presidency, Eleanor recalled, extra helpers were brought in for the guests who followed him home. The dozen was a floor, not a ceiling. Roosevelt died at Springwood on April 12, 1945. What followed represents the final transformation this episode tracks. The moment a private household converts into a public institution, and the question of the staff changes owners entirely. Roosevelt himself had arranged the mechanism years earlier. In 1939, he procured the transfer that would make his home a National Historic Site, reserving life interests for his family so they could remain as long as they lived. A life interest is worth defining here, because it is one of the law's gentler instruments, and it sat directly beneath this episode's questions. It grants a person not ownership of a property, but the right to live in and use it for the rest of their life. The right cannot be sold away lightly, and it dies with its holder, after which whatever remains passes to whoever holds the remainder interest. In 1945, that structure meant Roosevelt's family kept a home to inhabit, while the nation already held the house's future. Every servant working at Springwood worked inside that arrangement too, employed by a household whose tenure was legally generous but terminable by mortality, exactly like every tenure described before it. After his death, Eleanor Roosevelt and his children executed the next step. They waived those life interests and conveyed full title to the United States government. The meaning sits in who signed. A widow and heirs stood at a death's aftermath, holding legal interests in a property worked and maintained by others, and they signed those interests away. The estate passed not to another generation of private employers, but to a nation, which is to say, to an agency, a budget, and a class of custodian very different from a lady's maid reporting to a housekeeper. On April 12, 1946, exactly 1 year after Roosevelt died, Springwood opened to the public. At the dedication, Eleanor told visitors they might come away with some sense of healing and courage themselves from understanding what her husband had drawn from the place. Her words concerned the president. The occasion concerned his house, which now belonged to everyone, operated by an institution rather than by any family, a custodian unlike anything that had employed its last dozen private servants. What became of those dozen in the transition, the record consulted here does not say. Some may have continued under the new institutional management, since historic sites still needed the same rooms kept and gardens tended. Some may have retired on whatever arrangements the family or the transfer provided. Some may have scattered into other Hudson Valley households the way servants always had. The paperwork of transferring an estate to a government records the estate. People attached to it cross over, or do not, in the silence between documents. Agecroft Hall made the same journey by a slower road. Williams had designed his will so that the house could not die with him. The trust for Elizabeth, the separate fund endowed strictly for Agecroft's upkeep, and the eventual institutional designation all worked toward the same end, keeping a Tudor manor assembled in Richmond, maintained and staffed indefinitely, regardless of who lived in it. Elizabeth Booker Williams kept her lifetime residence there under those arrangements, occupying the house across 4 decades that spanned the entire period this episode has followed. Her residency lasted longer than Amanda Swanson's employment at Prairie Avenue, longer than the Leach's service at Vizcaya, longer than most careers the era offered anyone born to Swedish immigrant farm families. She finally moved out in 1967. 2 years later, in 1969, the Tudor Manor opened to the public as a museum, becoming at last the institution Thomas Williams had imagined in his will. The Upkeep Trust is worth naming plainly, because it solves a problem most servants' employers never faced. A house with an endowed maintenance fund keeps requiring gardeners and cleaners and caretakers after its family departs, which means the institution absorbed the staffing question along with the roofline. The workers inside such transitions served employers with corporate patience instead of mortal calendars, and their job security rested on endowment performance rather than any person's health. Notice what both transitions share. The houses survived their families. The wills had seen to that, funding upkeep through trusts and naming institutional futures in advance. The staff questions did not survive in the documents because the documents transferred property, not people. Whoever inherited the buildings inherited the labor problem invisibly attached to them, and the historical record moves on without recording whether any particular servant crossed that threshold as an employee, a pensioner, or neither. Set the 3 wills side by side now, because together they reveal something no single schedule shows alone. Charlotte Augusta Haig engineered annuities for a secretary and 2 servants. Continuing income designed to outlast her. Louise Vanderbilt itemized 6 charities down to the dollar and compressed her employees into a phrase. Thomas Williams created a category called long-time servants, honored it with a published range, and set that range below even his flat gift of $10,000 to friends. Different testators, different scales, one shared instinct. Only Thomas Williams's instrument even named service length, and even there, the figures were fixed ranges, rather than measures, of any particular tenure. Each of them shaped servant remembrance to fit the self-portrait the will was already drawing. Haig arranged dependents' incomes. Vanderbilt, surrounded by philanthropic expectation, funded a landmark for working women while declining to itemize her own staff. Williams, builder of a memorial to himself, priced loyalty as one exhibit among many in the family gallery. Beyond that one category, None of these instruments measured how long anyone had served or how well. What appears instead is the testator's own logic, expressed in the grammar of estates, charities, trusts, ranges, residues, with servants placed wherever that grammar happened to set them down. Intimate decades entered the calculation as atmosphere, not arithmetic. And here is the sharpest finding this comparison produces. For most servants in most houses, these elegant instruments were never the relevant protection anyway. Wages, notice, and the character letter decided ordinary careers, and all three sat outside every will ever drafted. The wills governed the exceptional few, custom governed everyone else, and custom evaporated the moment the person embodying it did. A mansion's contents are divided, valued, sold, inherited, or preserved. Its people disperse by the same legal weather but without catalog cards, which returns everything to Chicago, to 1936, and to the woman standing in a room full of inventoried furniture, being asked what she wanted. The Glessners had furnished their Prairie Avenue house in 1887, and the oak chests upstairs probably dated from that first outfitting of the home. Nearly 50 years of service had worn those rooms through generations of household workers, whose names arrived and departed in a payroll book. By 1936, the chests were old, plain, and worth so little that the estate inventory priced each of them at exactly $3. John Glessner died in January of that year, and the waiting this episode has described from the outside now had a specific address. Somewhere above the kitchens, a 54-year-old laundress could count the shape of her own future without any lawyer announcing it. The house would not support her position indefinitely once its reason for existing had closed. Whatever notice or settlement custom produced would arrive on its own schedule, and the character she would need for any next position lived in memories that had just lost their keeper. Nothing about that arithmetic required malice to bite. It required only procedure plus time. What followed for the house was the process this episode has been tracing everywhere else, translated now into one building's actual furniture. The family cleared the home. Objects accumulated over half a century were assessed against the inventory and dispersed according to inheritance, retention, and sale. The residence stopped being a place where life happened and became a collection of things that belonged to an estate. Amanda Swanson was still there while it happened, 7 years into her employment, doing whatever the diminishing household still required of its laundress. The family would retain and pass down whatever the inheritance assigned them, a house's worth of objects moving by will and kinship onto their next lives. She stood to leave with whatever the clearing process left unclaimed, which is the arithmetic every dissolved household forced on its workers. Whole rooms of value flowing one direction and a packed trunk the other. Then came the moment the museum's researchers later documented. As the family cleared out the house in 1936, Amanda was invited to keep any furniture from her room. No record preserves what was said when the invitation reached her. No account describes her walking the room, opening drawers, deciding what her quarters held beyond that chest. A bed's frame, washstand, chair, or pegs on a wall is unrecorded, and so their fates are simply lost. The archive holds only the action itself, and the action is this. She chose the 5-drawer oak chest. Of everything her room contained, she took the object the lawyers valued at $3. It is worth pausing on what that choice actually transferred. The chest was hers now, in a way nothing else in 26 years of Chicago laundry work had ever been. Not wages, which spent and vanished. Not lodging, which belonged to the position and died with it. A thing, wooden, heavy, 5 drawers deep, manufactured around the year the house was born, priced by the estate at almost nothing, and now the single piece of property with which she crossed from service back into ordinary citizenship. Whether any other staff member received a similar invitation is not recorded. Whether she was owed weeks of notice or wages in lieu under some arrangement nobody wrote down cannot be established from what survives. Her settlement, if the word even applies to a laundress leaving a dissolved household, has left no trace. These absences deserve respect rather than suspicion. The estate papers were written to settle an estate, not to narrate a worker's departure, so they recorded what the estate needed recorded and ignored the rest. Silence here means only that no document cared, which is different from saying nobody did. It is worth being precise about what the invitation itself represented, because nothing in law required it. Wages and notice were obligations. An offer to keep the furniture of one's own room was grace, extended by a particular family during one particular clearing, recorded nowhere as policy, and owed nowhere as duty. In the same years that other estates settled their staff accounts through ledgers alone, this household asked a laundress what she wanted before the vans came. The gesture cost little and signified much, which is presumably why it survived in memory when the payroll figures did not. Grace was precisely the category this episode's legal machinery could not process. And here it is, arriving at the last possible moment to send one worker out with something in her arms. Somewhere between the inventory and the locked door, Amanda Swanson became the sole authorized carrier of one oak chest out of Prairie Avenue. Everything else the house had given her stayed behind as the house's own business. The question every dissolved household forced on its workers then arrives on schedule. Where does a woman go from there, at 54, in the winter of 1936, in a Depression city, with a trade, a trunk, and $3 worth of inherited oak? The record cannot say what her first months out of Prairie Avenue looked like. No document marks where she lived in 1937 or 1938 or what work she found, because between employments, a servant left almost no shadow on paper. The gap itself belongs to this story. A decade of steady positions shows up in censuses and payroll entries, while the hard interval between them, the searching, the waiting, the arithmetic of rent against day work, happens in the blank spaces that records were never built to hold. When she surfaces again in 1940, it is inside someone else's enumeration, one line among 23 lodgers, which is how the decade chooses to describe whatever it took. The 1940 census finds her, 4 years later, at 1417 North Dearborn Street. The building was a boarding house, and Amanda appears among 23 lodgers listed in it. Her occupation reads, housework, private home, which researchers take to mean domestic work in the Gold Coast mansions near where she now slept. The geography made the arrangement workable, since Dearborn Street sat close enough to the grand lakefront addresses that a woman on foot could reach their kitchen doors and be at a scrub board by morning. It is the only record of her ever doing anything besides laundry. A census row is a strange kind of biography. The enumerator wanted a head count, an address, an age, an occupation, and moved on, compressing everyone it touched into the same shallow columns. What those columns preserve here, without trying to, is the shape of an entire survival strategy. 23 lodgers under one roof meant 23 separate arrangements of rent and work, converging on a single building, a crossroads of people living alone in a city that priced solitude by the week. Among them, the record places a 59-year-old laundress, fresh out of a dissolved mansion household, holding no position that housed her, paying for a bed like any other lodger, and walking out each morning toward whatever private house had work that day. The arithmetic of that address reads plainly enough. The servants' quarters on Prairie Avenue had housed her inside her work, surrounded by a working household's rhythm. The boarding house on Dearborn Street charged her cash for a bed among 23 strangers, while she walked elsewhere each day to earn the money paying for it. Independence and exposure arrived together, as they generally do. She paid her own way now, and every week's balance depended entirely on finding the next private house that needed help. Then the census of 1950 records something close to stability recovered, though on terms worth reading closely. Amanda had returned to live-in service, this time as one of 3 servants employed in an apartment at 2430 North Lakeview Avenue, Unit 5S, in the household of an attorney named Robert Adams. The staff consisted of a laundress, a cook, and a maid. Amanda was the laundress again, back where she had started professionally 30-plus years earlier. The census taker recorded that each of the 3 servants worked 80 hours per week. For the prior year, it recorded Amanda's earnings, $1,300. Across the hall, in Unit 5N, lived Marshall Field IV, child of the department store Dynasty whose flagship store stood a mile south. That adjacency belongs to no metaphor anyone needs to supply. The record simply places a department store heir on one side of a corridor, and the woman who boiled another great family's linens on the other, both addresses chosen by the same city, the same market, the same era that produced them. 80 hours, 16-hour days across a 5-day stretch, or longer days spread thinner, however the schedule fell. At $1,300 a year, her weekly compensation ran about $25 before taxes and lodging considerations. She was 69 years old that census spring. The numbers do not require commentary. They require only reading, which is what a census is for. The 2 wage figures in her file bracket, her whole documented career. In 1929, she earned $4.50 a day, plus car fare from a household that then did not house her. 20 years later, she earned $1,300 a year inside an apartment where she also lived and worked around the clock. Between those numbers sits everything this episode has traced. The Depression survived on day rate margins. The mansion dissolved. The boarding house years. the return to live-in service because room and board remained the only benefits her trade had ever reliably paid. No pension intervened between the figures. The trade itself, unchanged in its essentials, simply absorbed her for 2 more decades, changing around her in 100 small ways while staying exactly the same in every one that paid. 2 survival strategies stand 10 years apart in these documents. In 1940, she bet on independence, renting among strangers, and chasing day work through wealthy streets. In 1950, she bet on the old system again, trading 80 hours a week for room, board, and cash inside somebody else's apartment. Neither strategy built a pension. Both kept her off charity rolls and off the street, which in that decade, for that trade, at that age, counted as winning more often than society deserved to admit. 3 years after that census, the record marks her exit from working life with administrative precision. On February 13, 1953, 3 days after turning 72, Amanda Swanson applied for Social Security. The application is the last active document of her career, a form filed by a woman who had begun working before old age benefits existed anywhere in America and who outlasted into eligibility anyway. The timing deserves one clean sentence of context. She applied at 72 for a benefit available at 65, which means the working life extended 7 years past the age the country had meanwhile decided should mark retirement for everyone else. Whatever combination of need, habit, and circumstance held those 7 years in place cannot be read from the form. And the form shows only where the career ended, and it ended in an application window rather than at a farewell gathering, with paperwork standing in where a pension party never came. She left Chicago and returned to Porter, Indiana, the county of her birth, to live with her sister. On August 6, 1956, she died there at 75 and was buried nearby in Chesterton. The family's memory of her survived in exactly the Register family's keep. The aunt who showed up with treats, who remembered the children, who carried something warm back and forth across the distance between her life and theirs. What never appears anywhere in her long paper trail is just as telling. No pension from the Glessner years, no legacy under any will examined here, because no will examined here names her, no reference letter, saved or unsent. The character that governed her employability lived and died in unwritten opinion, exactly as the law allowed. After 7 years in a mansion, her documented estate consisted of a boarding house bed, service recorded in payroll books and 2 censuses, and 1 wooden chest. The chest, at least, can be followed further, and where it goes says more than any summary could. It left Prairie Avenue in 1936, the way furniture leaves a dissolved household, carried by the person entitled to carry it. For the rest of Amanda's working life, it presumably did what it had always done, held the possessions of a working woman in a boarding house room, then in a live-in servant's room on Lakeview Avenue, then in whatever room she kept in her sister's house in Porter, Indiana. 5 drawers, moving through 4 recorded addresses, outlasting the employments that had sheltered each of them. Somewhere in those Indiana years, it passed to her nephew Victor Swanson, the family member who remembered her as the aunt with the treats and the gifts. From Victor it passed down to his daughter, Christina Amanda Swanson Miracle, who carried the family's knowledge of whose chest this had been and whose room it had stood in. In 2025, Christina donated the oak chest to Glessner House. The museum received it, her gift and its story attached, the story of the great-aunt who had been John Glessner's laundress, who had kept the chest in her quarters, who had carried it out under the estate's own invitation. Curators placed it in the restored servant's bedroom, where it became the first original piece of servant's furniture returned to that room. That designation carries its own quiet argument. Museums had spent a century preserving the showrooms of such houses, the parlors and dining rooms their owners designed for display. Restoring where the workers slept required deciding that this, too, was history worth furnishing accurately. The chest became that decision's first physical fact, an object standing in for every object from every servant's room that nobody thought to keep. Visitors climbing to the staff floor now find her name attached to the plainest category of object the 1887 house ever contained: storage for storage's sake, built to be identical 4 more times over. That last fact deserves its full weight. The inventory that priced her chest at $3 recorded 5 of them, identical, interchangeable, the kind of furnishing bought in batches for rooms nobody decorated. 4 siblings of her chest vanished into the clearing of 1936 and the decades after it, their locations unrecorded, their survival unknown. Somewhere they may survive too, unidentified in an estate sale's wake or worn out in some attic, indistinguishable from any other plain oak dresser of the 1880s. Without her name attached, even a surviving sibling would say nothing. Provenance is what turns furniture into evidence, and provenance was carried out of Prairie Avenue by exactly 1 worker with 1 chest. Hers survived because 1 family kept passing it down, and 1 descendant chose to give it back. Everything about that survival was contingency. Had Victor's children not wanted it, had Christina not known the story, had the museum lacked the restored room to put it in, the chest would survive only as 1 more line valued at $3 in a 1936 document. The record of Amanda Swanson's existence would then consist of 2 census rows and a payroll entry, which is to say, roughly the same as most servants who ever worked in such houses. The mourning papers of the era followed the same law of survival from the other direction. Black-bordered stationery had peaked with Queen Victoria, whose death in 1901 put mourning goods into shop windows on a national scale, and the tradition ran so deep that it resurfaced at royal deaths more than a century later. When Prince Philip died in 2021, Elizabeth's household reached for the same vocabulary her predecessors had used after Prince Albert: black-edged notes and a royal coat of arms rendered in black, and the custom resumed openly under Charles. Paper remembers what institutions practiced. The border outlived the empire that standardized it. Between those 2 survivals, the bordered letter and the plain oak chest, lies the whole distance between how the era mourned its powerful and how it recorded everyone else. Death stopped the routines of great houses for weeks and generated inventories, notices, crepe, and chapel conversions worthy of the fortune departed. For a laundress in the attic, The same death fit inside one line of another family's paperwork. $3 for her chest, nothing for her name. What survived of her afterward survived against that grain, family by family, drawer by drawer, until a museum chose to write the missing line itself. Run back through every household this account has visited and count who arrived by name. At Glessner House, the researchers who documented Amanda Swanson's chest recorded 5 identical chests in the servants' quarters and preserved one worker's story. The colleagues who slept within yards of her, whoever shared those quarters across 7 years, appear nowhere in the account. At Vizcaya, Anna Maria Leach and Frederick Leach emerge whole, married, mobile, traceable to a Miami death date in 1989, while the rest of James Deering's village population remains exactly that, a population sized by architecture rather than biography. Flat Top Manor's National Park Service history lists the indoor staff by role: cooks, laundry maids, chambermaids, parlor maids, a butler, a chauffeur, and locates their homes precisely, 2 cottages behind the manor, without preserving a single name. Springwood kept about a dozen servants, and the historical summary keeps their job titles. The pattern is absolute. Structures survive, roles survive, wage figures survive, and persons vanish, unless some accident of documentation or family memory intervenes. A woman becomes recoverable when a museum acquires her furniture, when a naturalization paper preserves her maiden name, when a descendant remembers the treats she carried. Otherwise, the quarters stay furnished and empty at once, fully described and completely unpopulated. Payroll books make the point in its sharpest form. Great houses kept them faithfully, because wages were legal obligations requiring record. A payroll column could carry a worker's surname for years of weekly entries and still preserve nothing a biographer could use. No arrival age, no origin, no disposition at departure. The house documented her economically and knew her not at all. Where a fuller record exists, anywhere in these pages, it exists because somebody stepped outside the accounting relationship to notice a person, a family member, keeping memories alive, a museum researcher following a chest, an archivist preserving a naturalization file. Documentation followed obligation. Remembrance had to be volunteered. That asymmetry is itself the deepest finding this episode can offer about how service counted. An estate could price 5 oak chests to the dollar while recording none of their users' names, because pricing served settlement and naming served nobody. The process answered to. The documents were never broken. They performed perfectly for the people they were built around. Set against that backdrop, the range of outcomes already traced takes on its full shape. Bertha Cohn's staff kept their places for 39 years because one widow held wealth, authority, and intent. The Leaches lost employment and kept a city because skills and presumably savings gave them footing after the circuit ended. Named servants of 3 testators received sums fixed by schedules they never saw. Amanda Swanson walked out with a chest and rebuilt a working life across 2 censuses and 80-hour weeks. Every outcome required something beyond loyalty, some document, some survivor's choice, some marketable skill, some relative with a spare room. And behind each of these recoverable stories stand the uncounted others, the majority whose employers died, and whose next positions began or failed without leaving a line anywhere. For them, the question this episode opened with has no archived answer at all, only the structural answer the system itself provides. Whatever happened, it happened by discretion, and discretion kept no records. That is why the exceptions matter more than their numbers suggest. Bertha Cohn, the Leaches, the named servants of 3 wills, and 1 laundress with an oak chest are visible precisely because something unusual bent toward them. A long-lived widow, a marriage that doubled a paper trail, a testator's schedule, an invitation during a clearing. Each exception maps the boundary of the rule surrounding it. Where the record shows workers carried forward, it shows a reason. The rule itself, for everyone the reasons missed, was dissolution handled quietly and forgotten quickly. There is also an honest limit to place on everything just narrated. This account rests on museum research, Park Service biographies, census rolls, city directories, newspaper headlines, and labor history scholarship, all of it generated for purposes other than storytelling. Where it says a servant chose a chest, the choosing is documented. Where it says nothing about a conversation, a feeling, or a motive, that silence belongs to the sources, and inventing past their edge would produce a smoother story and a falser one. What can be known has been laid out. What cannot has been left visibly dark, because the darkness is evidence, too, of exactly how far the paper world extended and where it stopped. Notice, finally, that the very existence of these sources is a modern decision. Glessner House researched Amanda Swanson because it chose to accession her chest and restore her room. Vizcaya's researchers chased a parlor maid's maiden name through naturalization files because they wanted to know who lived in their village. The Park Services wrote biographies of mansions that include the servants' cottages. Remembering this labor is itself discretionary, an inheritance-era grace note extended backward across a century, and like every discretion examined in this account, it could have been declined. The difference is that here, at last, the discretion ran toward the workers instead of around them. One more inheritance from all this paperwork deserves naming before the end. Every fact recovered about these workers arrived as a byproduct of some other purpose: a census taken for representation, a directory compiled for commerce, a naturalization record created by law, a museum catalog built for curation. Nothing was written down in its own time, because their lives did not matter to whoever held the pen. They matter now because paper outlived intention, and because institutions, decades later, chose to read the margins carefully. History kept these workers the way probate kept the chests, incidentally, valued at almost nothing, saved by whoever happened to choose saving. So return one last time to the question this episode opened inside: the mansion whose master died while the laundress still worked upstairs. What happened to the servants? Everything documented here happened, and the documents agree on the mechanism behind all of it. The moment John Glessner died, Amanda Swanson stopped belonging to a household and started belonging to a process. The same instant repeated at Vizcaya in 1925, at Flat Top Manor in 1908, on Prairie Avenue in 1936, along the Hudson in 1945. A living employer's habits had governed the staff through presence, through the daily unspoken renewal of routines both sides understood. Death replaced presence with instruments, and from that hour forward, every worker's fate traveled through papers she rarely saw, drawn up by people who rarely knew her, executed under procedures that contained no column for her name. Did loyalty create security? The honest answer is narrower than either sentiment or cynicism prefers. It created exactly the security that paper could hold: wages owed, notice owed, a debt ranked ahead of legacies, and not one line further. Beyond those enforceable edges, loyalty functioned as memory in other people's hands. It weighed in a widow's decision to carry on for 39 years. It appeared in servant bequests of $1,000 to $3,000, within a schedule of cash gifts totaling $2,811,500. It shaped invitations to keep what stood in one's room. All of it real, all of it conditional, none of it hers to claim. Wherever a survivor kept choosing to provide continuity, the household's people could live secure. The moment no such choice operated, the machinery of inventory and settlement moved in, courteous, orderly, and indifferent. The opening promise asked what happened to the servants when the millionaire died. The full answer, tested across every documented household this account can reach, is that each of them met the same fork, wearing different faces. On one side stood whatever documents existed: wills naming them, wage accounts crediting them, characters vouching for them, invitations including them. On the other side stood everyone whose fate depended on nothing written at all, and those workers' outcomes rose and fell with the choices of survivors they could not influence. The death of an employer did not decide what happened to the servants. It decided who would decide, and everything followed from that transfer of penmanship. That is what the era's great households taught the people who ran them from the inside. Intimacy without documentation was a favor, renewed daily and revocable silently. The workers involved understood this earlier than the law did, which is why the character letter mattered more than any statute, and why its absence at death cut deeper than any fee. The chest sits now in a restored servant's bedroom on Prairie Avenue. 5 drawers of plain oak with a provenance label carrying Amanda Swanson's name. The house that once inventoried her furnishing at $3 preserves her furniture and her story, the only thing from those quarters that made it back. She carried it out of dissolution in 1936 because somebody asked what she wanted and let her keep an answer. Every institution this account has followed made its own version of that moment, choosing what succession would mean for the people attached to a house. Bertha Cohn chose decades of continuity. The Roosevelt family chose transfer to a nation. Thomas Williams chose a memorial, with servants priced into its schedule. Most estates chose procedure alone, which was itself a choice felt in kitchens within weeks. The record keeps outcomes and discards deliberations, so nobody can say how often retention was weighed before being declined. Objects outlast the systems that use them, but only sometimes, and never reliably. 1 drawer's worth of oak, by luck and by love, came home to the room where it began, and it stands there holding the whole account together.